next 3 sessions of Smart Keyboard Musings is intended to be a trilogy. So it's a 3-part musings, and this is the first part. And this is titled as Fluidity, which is the flow in the testing approach. So, what is this trilogy all about? What is it they're trying to talk here? So this trilogy, which I titled as Human Symphony in Testing, is primarily about reimagining testing as a performance, as a dialogue, as a relationship in the age of where we build intelligent systems. So the whole idea is to see this as an act of symphony, where we see testing from a more human dimension, where, like a symphony, it moves in very distinct movements, connected though. How we engage with systems, outcomes, and ourselves. And therefore we kind of see, is there a notion of flow? Is there a notion of rhythm? Is there a sense of listening and dialogue? And therefore, how do we see this testing as a lived experience of discovery? So, in these 3 sessions, we will look at it from the flow, the cadence, and the act of listening. And therefore, reimagining testing as performance, dialogue, and relationship. So today, we will probably muse on the idea of fluidity and rigidity, and what it means in the approach to testing, and what it means in the approach from a flow perspective. First things first, when we look at testing itself, I guess we more often look for certainty, that we want to be sure about something that we do, in terms of the way it is structured, the plan, the strategy, the test cases, the scripts. We look at it from the view of precision, and of course, the ability to justify and prove. But truly speaking, the higher level meaning of what we do is in the overall movement of how the whole act goes, the flows, the adaptations, and the holds. And the holds, I mean, is the rigidity, if you will. So on one side there is a notion of fluid flow, and the other side there is this notion of rigidness. When I say rigid, meaning we are able to prove, we are able to be sure, and so on and so forth. And therefore, quality is really, as we all talk about, it's not about just what we confirm as right or wrong, but in how we question, what we question, how we sense, what we learn, etc. Right? So that's really the whole act that we are trying to get into more often in a world where systems are intelligent and the act of building systems itself is becoming intelligent. So, if we take it from a slightly different dimension of looking at it as assurance, let's say, is not more about control. It's more about rhythm. And therefore, what if we looked at the rhythm as a composition, a yin and yang composition of flow, the fluidity, and the form, which is rigidity, where the fluidity in a way helps assurance sense. We observe, we learn, we sense, and then we adapt and therefore evolve. On the contrary, the rigidity gives it structure, discipline, order. And that's the kind of rhythm that we want. Of course, it's not going to be absolutely what you might see it as this perfect ripple, as you can see in the picture, but it's a kind of a ripple, right? It moves. And that's the rhythm that we see. And if we get into that rhythm, then probably the way we work, the way we test, and the way we generate outcomes are probably far more interesting. So just to quickly examine what they might be and look at it from various dimensions later, we'll start with the notion of what it is. I think we all understand the idea of fluidity, like water. It adapts, it explores, it evolves. Fluidity encourages discovery. It helps us respond to change, agile. It breeds a certain sense of awareness. That is, we are very immersed in that particular context. Whereas rigidity, on the other side, is anchors, stabilizes, sustains. It gives us a sense of reliability. It helps us preserve the intent and certainly gives us a purpose and direction. Both seem to be on the opposite side, right? Quite by the words of fluidity and rigidity, they both seem to be in the opposite. An assurance per se matures when the hard structure is guided by awareness. That means fluidity. And this awareness reshapes and shapes the structure. And that symbiotic yin and yang is what is probably smarter ways of looking at assurance and higher order of thinking and delivery. Right? And that's when we see a significant maturation of testing that happens when the fluidity and rigidity coexist as complements and not opposites. And that's why we said that the trilogy is about a symphony. Now, there are very many things now having kind of established, if you will, in terms of what is fluid, what is rigid, what the rules may be, how we can relook at testing. Let's probably look at it from different dimensions, or different aspects, from one, process and practice. What is their role? We all know there is a process that we use or expected to use. There is a personal practice that we follow, that we do. What is their role? Where do they fall into this notion? We all sometimes think of process as hard and practice as probably not so hard. Let's take a look. To a large degree, process puts in a certain sense of governance. The idea is consistency, and therefore it embodies rigidity. Whereas practice by itself is primarily about enabling curiosity and learning, to be connected to what we do, to apply techniques and heuristics, logical ways of doing, but more often being very observant, being very curious, constantly adapting and learning, which are all embodiments of fluidity. So it is quite natural to think of a process as being more supportive of rigidity and the practice being more of being fluid. And therefore, if you want to summarize this and think about it, process gives the act of assurance, the testing, structure. Whereas the practice that we follow as individuals gives it life. And that is why that symbiotic nature of process and practice is primarily very important. And practices may be driven by methodology. Methodologies are methods, techniques, heuristics, and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And what they do, therefore, is they transform the notion of assurance from a mere procedure into a more of a living rhythm of awareness. And that's where the role of process and practices with respect to the human symphony of fluidity and rigidity. Like the tall tree, the palm tree, for example, which is on the ocean and ocean front, which is buffeted by a lot of winds, but still stands tall. The process sustains teams. Despite all the heavy winds, it creates certain predictability. It puts in some shared alignment, and that's why we need some kind of a process. Whereas, the tree may be slightly bent, but it still is tall enough. The leaves may move in the direction of the wind and keeps the entire notion of aliveness. And that is where the practice comes in. The aliveness through questioning, exploration. And both of them are important. A form without a flow stagnates. A flow without a form disperses. It doesn't add value. It just flows everywhere. So we need a certain amount of direction so that the flow goes in a particular area. Otherwise, it'll just be stuck. If I didn't have any form, if I had no channels, for example, the water would flow everywhere, and that would be a problem. So I think in this sense, the form and the flow becomes important, and flow is very individualistic, right? Form is more often, in large degree, externally put in place, right? So a process holds. It gives predictability and rhythm. A practice flows. It keeps the learning alive. And that art that each one of us have ultimately is about blending the both, right? And that is where we elevate the entire act of testing and obviously get to the higher level of smartness. So as you can see, form gives direction, flow gives discovery, right? Now let's look at it from another aspect. We talked about process and practice in the context of fluidity and rigidity. What about entities? You can call it features, you can call it flows, you can call it requirements. But when you talk about entities, we're talking about any of those. But then we're asking, there are things that we build new, things that we modify. And therefore, a state of an entity could be new, or existing ones which are modified, or maybe sometimes unmodified. What is their role in fluidity and rigidity? Right? That's what we want to probably muse on a little bit. Whenever we test something new, maybe it's a new feature, for example, we all know that we like not to be constrained by what has been already been thought through. And therefore, it, in a way, invites fluidity. We explore, we improvise, we keep it open. So we may come up with an idea to test, a set of test cases to run it on, a strategy that we have thought through. But then when we test something the first time, the new one, what is new to us, we don't stop just with the what we have by the given form, but we explore. Whereas when it comes to, let's say, features that are being extended, modified, fixed, and therefore it requires certain balance, we want to do two things. We want to preserve what endures. That means we want to know what is working, continues to work. And we want to adapt, change our approach, test cases, scripts, whatever, what shifts. Whereas things that are not modified, we value more often rigidity. That means we want to rerun the same test cases, maybe call it whatever you want. You can call it regression, for example. You want it to be steady. You want to be able to repeat it because you want to be confident that it is not broken. So on one side, the one extreme of new, there seems to be far more fluid. On the other extreme of unmodified, it seems to be far more rigid. And in between, so to speak, is a balance. And that's how one may want to look at the state of the features of the product that is being built from the viewpoint of fluidity and sim. So each feature has its own rhythm. The new ones kind of flow, the mature ones kind of hold. Hold means rigid, right? And testing must move with this rhythm. Sensing when to adapt and figuring out when to anchor. Anchor gives you the sense of rigidity, consistency. You want to be sure, repeat, right? So therefore, each of these states, in a way, call for a distinct rhythm between the flow and the form. Let's look at it from another angle. The artifacts. What is their role? We have plans, we have reports, we have test cases, we have scripts. What is fluidity and rigidity in these? Of course, we have got various kinds of elements. We could have a test strategy, plan, test cases, report, and test scripts, and so on. So what is their role? Just trying to examine here. When you look at strategy, for example, it invites insight. That means we are trying to do some stuff. We want to gain some insight. It invites a deeper look. And once we have a good understanding, we like to lock it. It holds. because it clarifies the purpose of what we're doing. A plan, by the way, obviously is much more operational in nature, and therefore it flows, it guides, but it hopefully is not too stringent, as plan is about who does what, when, with, etc. Right? It kind of holds when it aligns with the intent. So as you can see here, that a strategy has a certain flow when it invites an insight, and it holds when the purpose is well understood. Whereas a plan flows when it kind of guides lightly. That means you're not giving a very strict plan. You say, look, figure it out. But it holds when we are very sharp with that intent. Intent could be evaluate this piece for this kind of an issue on this kind of environment from this kind of a end user point of view, and therefore that could be, you don't have to unnecessarily go everywhere. You can just be very sharp about it. Right? Now take the next set of elements of test cases or scenarios and any reports that we look at. When you look at it from the angle of fluidity and rigidity, a test case is very rigid when it codifies the learning. It says, do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Look for these kinds of stuff. So it prescribes a very clear set of actions to do, data to input, things to observe, and therefore a clear notion of pass or fail. So it seems to be very clear. It's rigid. But when we are trying to think of it more like not from just as an act of evaluation, but a probing exercise. And in the process of probing, in the practice of probing, we probably appreciate something more. And when it is a probing kind of an approach, it's more of flowing. When it is more of execution, evaluation kind of an approach, it's more like holding or being rigid. Similarly, when you look at it when you look at a report, when you have a particular template and you say, here are the kinds of pieces of information you want to record, that's more like holding, being very rigid. But when you are able to interpret something interesting, when it's able to give nice insights, it helps you to interpret, then it's more flowing. So the notion of rigidity and fluidity from the act of, the test artifacts, where every artifact should breathe with both these parts that hold, parts that flow. And this beautiful balance is what makes fluidity, makes them come alive, and the rigidity preserves their meaning. That balance is what elevates the entire act of assurance into a much higher order. So fluidity gives artifacts the life, and rigidity gives them the continuity. So we're not saying that you should go totally bonkers on one side or totally bonkers on the other side. It's the craftsmanship is in that beautiful symphony that we're trying to weave. Now let's take a little more deeper dive into the axis of thinking. What do you mean by axis of thinking? The typical 5W1H. What, when, where. How does these two terms relate to those? If I look at it from the dimension of why, purpose, what is rigid? What is fluid? It is rigid when purpose is clear and enduring. So if there is a very clear, sharp, well-formed purpose that is given to us, then the why question is narrow, clear, and need not be all the way around. It's very rigid. But if the purpose is a process of discovery, it's more like a vision, then you have to broaden it, reorient it, then it is fluid. So what is our intent now? We want to anchor the system. So we want to be sharpening our purpose. So I want to say, hey, I want to find issues. Now if you ask, what issues? Where do you want to find? How do you want to go about finding them? Why is it important? So, you're starting to look at now why, from that perspective, right? And then you start answering more other questions of what, where, etc., leading from there. So when you say what, it kind of defines the scope. So what is rigid? when the boundaries are very clear. Here are 5 features to test. Here are 3 flows to test. Why is it fluid? I discover something new. So what is the insight from this? A constant adaptation of scope as the context evolves. So which means I am not making the scope hard, nor am I keeping the scope vague. I'm kind of saying, look, in the context of what are the scope, the constant sense is to adapt the scope as the system, as the context evolves. Moving further, the notion of what for. Okay, I want to test a what. I want to test this feature, this flow, this component. For what? For some value. What do you mean value? When you say clearly that this is the intended outcome, then it's very clear. The criteria is well stated. So if the value or the criteria is well stated, then it seems reasonably rigid. See, rigidity does not mean bad. It means I'm reasonably clear now. But if the expression of value is constantly changing or adapting or adjusting because I'm still figuring it out, then that is fluid. So what's the insight from the notion of value? Hold the intent, but let the interpretation continue to grow. So we're constantly expanding the notion of the value as we understand, right? So we want to really ask, we started off with why the purpose, then we said what is the scope, and then what for, and moving further, the approach. So we want an approach where we want clear set of steps to ensure consistency. That is why more often people end up writing the how part of it for test cases, when it's really the what and the what for more often. But we also know that especially with test cases, we explore, we don't write as much because it enriches the design. So what's the insight with respect to the approach from the viewpoint of fluidity and rigidity? The method of how we do has to have a good balance between precision and creativity. Right? That's the insight from this angle. The when. So we talked about why, we talked about what, we talked about what for, we talked about how, and now it's about when, which is about timing. So we want predictability, but we want agility, which is the most complicated stuff that we all suffer with. Where we want commitments to be met because they're critical. That's rigid. You don't have a choice. But we want flexible iterations. We want to move it around a little bit here and there. We invite flexibility in the way we do things in each of the iterations. But the insight is, they have to, in some sense, coexist, and that is where the when part of it comes from. And that's the relationship of fluidity and rigidity in the context of when. Which I think is a corollary in the context of how much is the effort. So we want perfect numbers. We want precision in terms of the amount of time, the effort, the money, the budget, the risk. But then the problem is we need elasticity too, because we want to learn, we want to adjust, we want to be able to figure out a few things. So what we want approximates. So the ranges, in some sense, the insight is awareness of uncertainty. Because we know there is no pure precision. It's a notion of how much do I not know? What is the level of fuzziness? That is what is the insight. And that is what helps us to stay reasonably confident. Right? And finally, from the people perspective, the ownership we want steady, but the participation we want, in some sense, fluid. That means we want more collaboration to deepen the practice. But we want to have a clear notion of who is responsible for what, and therefore clearly outline accountabilities for people and rules. But then what we want is, just because we have that accountability doesn't mean I should not do something else. I expect other people to step up and collaborate in other ways. So, what is notion of fluidity here and stuff? Yes, I clearly know what I should be doing. I know my accountability, but I should also be able to extend and collaborate so that the practice is deepened. So that's what the idea, the insight is. Ownership is steady. but the participation is fluid. So the fluidity and rigidity in a way live in all our daily choices, from why we test to how we act. The why must anchor, the how and when must move with the awareness. And therefore, the testing intelligence really lies in sensing which of the axis must hold and which of the axis must flow. We are not saying that here you completely hold or you completely flow. We are just trying to say, look, there is an insight from each one of them. So what we need is, we need to sense what makes appropriate sense. And that is where the testing intelligence becomes much more evolved, smarter. So, the notion of fluidity and rigidity with respect to the artifact is every artifact carries its balance. Which parts must hold firm, where it must be precise, which parts must flow, where we need to reflect and therefore where it must kind of breathe. And therefore, if you look at each one of those elements that we talked about, strategy, plan, case, reports, we want a strategy that holds rigidity in its why and flows in how. We want a plan that holds in commitment but flows in execution. Remember, we are connecting now the artifacts to those thinking dimensions of 5W and 1H. A test case, we want it to be rigid or holds in the how-to, ensuring the repeatability, but we want certain ideas like smarter checks or smarter checklists or test ideas that stay reflective and directional rather than being stiff. We want a report that is rigid with respect to the metrics that it quantifies, it holds, but we want it to also have narrative that flows, that help us interpret. And I hope you can understand, you can kind of see the connection of why, what, etc. in the context of the fluidity in the artifacts, of how they manifest as fluidity and rigidity. And the mastery of assurance lies in this knowing when does the form study and when does the flow renew. And that is the beauty and the symphony, and that's the yin and yang of higher order testing. And lastly, I'm going to take a couple of more minutes, I hope we have the time, is on the role of mindset. I'm sure you must have seen some of this Tao kind of a statement. If you go and study Tao, it'll say walk on water. What do we mean? It says fluid mind questions, senses, adjusts. That's a mindset that I need. Whereas a rigid mind, a focused mind, focuses, studies, and sustains. So I want to have that focus, but I want to have that fluidity. And that's like the principle of Tao, right? The balance of yin and yang, the ability to walk on water. And when our mindset understands these two and they're able to merge this, which is a very key personal trait, then the testing becomes very dependable on one side and very dynamic and adaptable on the other side. And that's extremely powerful. So this is from the philosophical notion of, let's say, inspired by Tao. If I go on a slightly different pitch and then look at it from the Tao perspective, from water, it simply says, look, be like water. Which is kind of what we talked about very briefly before. And when you go back to, let's say, another set of philosophy in Upanishads, it keeps saying that, hey, when you want to understand something, it is not about what you know. It is about what is not there. So it is more like saying, if I describe something what is, it is equally important to describe what is not. What is normally known in Sanskrit as neti. Neti means no. Not this, not that. So what are we trying to talk about here? We're trying to talk about the fact that what is in some sense rigid. What is not is some kind of fluid. So that's why in a spec, for example, it's no more sufficient to say what it should do. It is equally important to specify what is not, but that's an unbounded space, and that is where the trouble is. Right? And that is why I think we need to be focused, but we also need to be very adaptive. And that is where the notion of Tao principle of be like water comes in pretty powerful. Right? So together, they kind of illuminate the assurance as awareness in motion, constant, continual awareness. And that is what makes it very immersive. So when I talk about high mist, I talk about as a methodology, I talk about from the context of immersiveness, which is being connected, right? Where there is fluidity that is guided by wisdom, and rigidity held with grace. And finally, if you were to summarize and put them all together, they're all in a very beautiful tapestry. And somehow they all beautifully hang together. Process gives assurance, its frame. Practice gives it breadth. Artifacts give it expression. Mindset gives it consciousness. So we've kind of elevated the entire simple act of that what we do into this. The frame, the living aspect of breath, the ability to express beautifully, and finally elevated to a higher level of consciousness. Right? And when all these four move together, that's a beautiful rhythm. And that is the human symphony in the context, looking at it from fluidity and simplicity. So quality is when awareness flows as awareness, not just as outputs, bugs, test cases and stuff, right? So before we wind down, take a minute to reflect on this. Where does your process need to breathe more freely? Where does your practice need firmer grounding? How can your artifacts embody both clarity and curiosity? And this awareness of this balance is what marks the shift from a mechanical approach to testing to a far more mindful approach to testing. And today, with AI support, we only can accelerate it and do a much higher order piece of work that we can possibly do. So, as a parting remark, fluidity is inspiration. It inspires. Rigidity strengthens us, and taken together, they can shape the assurance that adapts with awareness and endures it with a purpose. Right? And that is what probably, as we go forward into the future, I think these become more important things that we have to probably realize, because systems are intelligent to do some of the more mundane work. So, concluding, when assurance flows, it listens. When it holds, it guides. Between the two lies the awareness, the essence of testing as a living, breathing act. Flow gives it life. Form gives it strength. And together they make quality an experience which is alive, which is evolving, and which is whole. Thank you so much.